Good evening, everybody. If I can ask you all to please have a seat. We're going to get started shortly. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name's Adriana Flores, and I am class of Dartmouth 2013. And I'd like to welcome you to the Veritas Forum here at Dartmouth College. The Veritas Forum is an opportunity for the Dartmouth community to come together and explore life's hardest questions. The students and campus ministers who have planned this forum are inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer to our institution in its search for knowledge, truth, and significance. With that inspiration, we welcome those who bring other backgrounds, perspectives, and commitments to the table. And we honor all questions, just as we bring questions of our own. Our hope is that this Veritas Forum will not be just an academic exchange of ideas, but rather that it will come out of the real community earnestly exploring questions of real importance. We hope tonight's events will draw all of its participants into real conversations, questions, discussions, stories, and friendships. The Veritas Forum at Dartmouth College is sponsored by Agape Christian Fellowship, Aquinas House, Atheists, Humanists, Agnostics at Dartmouth, Christ Redeemer Church, Christian Union, Crew Dartmouth, Day Foundation, Dartmouth Apologia, Dartmouth Faculty and Staff Christian Fellowship, Eleazar Willock Society, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the Navigators, the Office of Pluralism and Leadership, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at the Tucker Foundation, the Waterman Institute, and Wellspring Worship Center. We're grateful also for all the students, professors, campus ministers, and alumni who helped create this forum. During the first few minutes of tonight's presentation, we encourage you to fill out the cards that are on your chairs. If you can take a minute right now and we can fill it out together. There should be a pencil so you can fill that out. If you can fill, the first part is your role on campus. So if you're an undergraduate, a graduate student, faculty, or other, so if you're a community member, your background, all right, thank you very much. Please, once you're done, just leave it on your seat and we'll collect them at the end. We want everyone to fill out the survey online, whatever your background or belief is, whatever brought you today. We need your feedback to make sure that next year is even better than this one. So please take a few moments to make sure you complete the survey. We promise we won't spam you. And as a thank you, we'll enter all participants in a raffle for an iPad. So, all right, with that said, it is my privilege to introduce our presenters for tonight. Dr. Nabeel Qureshi holds an MD from Eastern Virginia Medical School and a master's in Christian Apologetics from Biola University, and a master's from Duke University in Religion. Formerly a devout Muslim, Qureshi has convinced the truth of the Christian faith through historical reasoning and a spiritual search for God. Since his conversion, he has dedicated his life to teaching, preaching, writing, and debating about faith. Our second speaker, Ravi Zacharias, is a noted Christian thinker and apologist to speak about pluralism, tolerance, and peace. For 35 years, Ravi Zacharias has spoken all over the world and in numerous universities, notably Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford University. He has addressed world leaders on the topic of peace and pluralism on many occasions, and is the author of numerous books, including Can Man Live Without God?, Jesus Among Other Gods, and The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks About with Buddha. He has been privileged to speak at the National Day of Prayer, the Pentagon, the United Nations Annual Prayer Breakfast, the first Annual Prayer Breakfast for African Leaders. He's presently Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University in Oxford, England. Please welcome Dr. Nabeel Qureshi and Ravi Zacharias with me.
No, I'm not Nabeel. I wish I were as good looking as him. I'm not Nabeel. Actually, neither of us is Michael Ramsden. As you well know, the original evening was to be Michael Ramsden delivering the talk tonight. And I've just returned from India. I was there for the last 18 days. And we've been in a whirlwind tour, starting off at Camp Gitmo, actually, at the naval base in Guantanamo Bay, and then on to Canada and then to India for 18 days. And just last week, as I was finishing up in India, I got a telephone call from Michael Ramsden, who had just returned from Hong Kong. And it was a very personal family situation that had come up that absolutely necessitated for him to make the choice to stay with the family on this particular need. So when Michael contacted me, he was literally on his way from the airport at Heathrow to his home in Oxford, and very much stirred by the need. And I said, Michael, I'm there for the second night anyway, so I'll do my part in the first night. You stay with your kids, they need you. His son is 12 years old and in need of his dad at this time. And as one who's been an itinerant for 4 decades, I know exactly how important things like that are. So he sends his very, very serious apologies and regret. You may not have been coming here not expecting to hear him, but I assured him you all would understand. He even said, Ravi, if it's not permissible, I will fly and I will come. I said, no, don't do that, Michael. And so I've asked Nabeel, my colleague, to join me. And the whole subject matter tonight is sort of a more audience-friendly one, I guess. Tomorrow night will be the challenge of presenting the whole theme of tolerance and respect and civility in the public square. My understanding of the subject tonight is basically to try and discuss the whole issue which Michael was to talk about. How do you engage people in the public square on the truth and the claims of the person of Jesus Christ? Ironically, the big conference I spoke at in the city of Hyderabad in India, which drew about 1,200 for 4 days. Os Guinness was with me for that, and also Ken Blanchard and a few other veteran speakers. They were also dealing with the issue of discussion of faith in the public square. India, of course, much more intensely a pluralistic society, although predominantly Hindu, secondarily Muslim, and the Christian worldview is truly a great minority out there, but with many other religions like Jainism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and so on. So we had a fascinating time with the 1,200 delegates in discussing it. That was more in a proclamational type setting in which I addressed it. My thanks to the organizers here and your hard work and preparing for us over all these weeks and months. It's an honor to be in Dartmouth. This is my first visit here, and for all of the participating groups and the sponsors, our heartfelt thanks. I will talk about the secular setting, and Nabeel, as you have heard from the description of his background, having come to faith in Jesus Christ from a Muslim upbringing, I came to know Christ, although nominally from a Christian upbringing, but practically speaking in a totally secular type of way, if not practically atheistic, at least in my forays into thought. God was never any part of my thinking except during exams. That was the only time I would think of the possibility that God existed, and if he did, it would be greatly valued if he would enable me with the answers for which I had not studied. I was looking for the miraculous all of the time. So we're talking to you, generally speaking, as those who are committed to Christ, wanting to know how to engage the person who is not, or maybe you are not in your own conviction and you're just here out of curiosity to see how we would engage you in a conversation like that, and why exactly the claims of Jesus Christ. I want to start from a very unfamiliar background to most of you in this, and I do it because it both chronologically and logically positions how society has changed, not just in the so-called secular marketplace, but I think this is a recognition that the very church needed to re-examine what she meant in the proclamation of the message of Jesus. You see, in the 1960s and 70s, when books were written on proclamational evangelism, how do you communicate the gospel in a secular and pluralistic society? There was a very simple definition given of evangelism. I remember looking at it as a newcomer and a fresh follower of Jesus. Here's what it said. Evangelism is the activity of the church in telling the gospel to sinners with the intent to bringing them to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Very simple, 2 or 3 lines, but immediately it could raise up some flags in a society like ours. But as the years went by, J.I. Packer, the noted English scholar, added an element or two in his definition. He said this: evangelism is to so present Jesus Christ to sinful men in order that through the power of the Holy Spirit they may come to put their trust in God through him, and this was the work of God in their lives, not of the proclaimer. So he added a very important caveat that the change of a heart of a listener is not so much manufactured or engineered by the proclaimer, but that it was actually the supernatural work of God in an individual's life. I can testify to that in my life. I think Nabeel would testify to it, and anybody who has made that change will say they had never ever envisioned their own paradigm shift in such dramatic proportions. But in 1974, the famed Lausanne Conference was held in Switzerland, at which the most noted evangelical writer of his time, John R.W. Stott, gave the definition of evangelism. Notice in the first one, it was one simple statement. Second one, an important qualifier was added. Now notice the third one. To evangelize is to spread the good news that Jesus Christ died for our sins and was raised from the dead according to the Scriptures, and that as reigning Lord, he now offers forgiveness of sins and the liberating gift of the Holy Spirit to all who repent and believe. Our Christian presence in the world is indispensable to evangelism, and so is that kind of dialogue whose purpose is to listen sensitively in order to understand. But evangelism itself is a proclamation of the historical, biblical Christ as Savior and Lord, with a view to persuading people to come to him personally and be reconciled to God. In issuing the gospel invitation, we have no liberty to conceal the cost of discipleship. Jesus still calls all who will follow him to deny themselves, take up their cross, and identify themselves with him in this new community. The results of evangelism include obedience to Christ, incorporation into his church, and responsible service in the world. Now, that is a mouthful of a description. Why? When I looked at this progression, I asked myself, why is this getting larger and larger, and each statement getting more and more qualified? I strongly suspect because society was changing in the way they were listening, and the church was changing in what it was that she was actually believing. That, I think, was John Stott's major concern. Does the Christian really understand what the gospel message is all about? So in other words, within about a 15-year span, the change in society and the change in the church became a very serious matter to restudy. And now when you ask a typical person who attends a church somewhere, can you explain the gospel to me? Chances are we might get some pretty surprising answers as to what it all actually means. So both the belief and / the believer over against the receptor or the receiver, both have changed dramatically in the last 40 years. Incredibly so. It was only in 1966, when I was 20 years old, that I moved from India to Canada. My change culturally was massive. Practically speaking, I had never stepped onto an escalator in my life. I never knew you were meant to obey the rules of the road. They say in America they drive on the right, in England they drive on the left, in India you drive in the shade, wherever you want to drive. The repositioning, somebody in Lebanon told me, in America the red light means stop, in Lebanon it means Christmas. That's the way we view it. The whole way of thinking was different. In fact, I was so prejudicially disposed that I needed a haircut within a week of my coming, and I didn't know where to go till in Toronto, where we lived on the main street, Yonge Street, I saw a barber shop that said Christian Brothers Barbershop. I said, wow, even the barber is a Christian, so I'm going to go in there. And after he charged me, I knew he wasn't. Unbelievable. I'd never paid that much for a haircut in my life. But my whole paradigm was under challenge. And what I noticed in the last 40 to 50 years, from the mid-60s till now, if somebody was sound asleep in the mid-60s and awakened now, they would have no clue they are really in the same country. In fact, in the 1980s, I remember at Rochester Institute in Toronto, sitting down in an auditorium and listening to Francis Schaeffer and Everett Koop. And I remember Francis Schaeffer making the comment. He says, the day will probably come in North America when you use the name of Jesus Christ, the average person will have no clue who it is you're really talking about. And at that time I thought, can't be. Really can't be. And for all practical purposes, as someone has said, any stigma can lick a good dogma. The name has been stigmatized, and if you ask an average person what his name really means, chances are you're more likely to hear all the negative side of what it means to follow him than the liberating experience of what he actually came for, to provide redemption for humanity. I want to give you the backdrop of really 2 sets of 4 and tell you what the goal is. You know, the average, the story is told of George Washington, who had a man on his cabinet who was totally bald, but had a very long flowing beard down to his knees. And Washington brought him up for an illustration, and he pointed to him and he said, this man has a problem: overproduction and poor distribution. I think that may well be reflective of what the gospel message is also all about. Producing and producing and producing, and the distributing lines have taken a hit because the people to whom we are trying to communicate this are really those who are not even understanding what is at the core of the gospel message, or certainly the barriers are up. So let me give you 2 sets of 4 as a proclaimer, and having done it now for about 4 decades in over 70 countries. When you and I are communicating in the public square, Guinness is very clear in making in distinguishing between the marketplace and the public square and so on. He says they are not identical terms, they are very different terms. But when you are discoursing, when you are communicating in any of these settings, these 4 points abide of what it means to effectively communicate: identification, translation, persuasion, and justification. Identification, translation, persuasion, and justification. Identification basically means to be able to identify with the listener, and you are communicating in such effective ideas that you are not at the same time erecting barriers before the listener who's listening to you. Let me give you a vivid example of this. In the early days of my speaking, I was in Birmingham, Alabama, and just finished my talk. I was in my 20s, and I stepped down after delivering that talk, and I was sitting in the middle of the church pew and leaning towards a couple that wanted to talk to me. And she had raised the question of God's purpose in suffering and pain and all of that. And I was on the verge of beginning my answer, when with the corner of my eye, I caught a little baby in the bassinet next to the parents. And one look, and I recognized the baby was born with some serious mental maladies. Just one look. And I swallowed hard and I said, this is not the time for a philosophical discussion on the problem of evil. I am talking to a woman with a very serious, practical, felt pain. Had I not recognized that, she would have probably looked at me minutes into my discourse and thought, this guy is totally disconnected from reality. Even if my answer were pertinent in setting the foundation, it would have been irrelevant to the woman who was seeking something more practical. And I say to you, the way times have changed, ladies and gentlemen, if we are not willing to take a step back and reevaluate how we identify with the listener, we will be deemed completely out of touch with the mindset of the person who is asking the question. We must listen well. We must listen carefully. And we must understand what the identification here really means. If a person has been a victim in some country due to race or grace or place or face or whatever, of some nature, that person, to that person, discrimination has very serious overtones, and you must understand that. I was raised in a culture like this. People in India don't like to admit it, but it is an extremely prejudicial culture, extremely prejudicial. And when we sit across a table and it opens up in conversation, and I point out how this has all been done, all the way from its substructure in its philosophical reasoning of inequality by birth and so on, it comes as a rude shock to an average Indian to see how prejudicial we were and are as a people. It's true, very true, painfully true. And why is it the North looks down upon the South? Why is it the South looks down upon the North? There are various issues that come to the fore. You must identify with the person. Another great example of this, when Russia opened up in the late 1980s, after the Berlin Wall fell in '89 and all that transpired afterwards, how people with the gospel message started rushing in there, never pausing to understand the wounds of a deeply injured civilization. The Russian people are a deeply wounded people for many, many decades, and to stand under a tree and present the gospel within 3 minutes and then ask for a decision and a response, the person would just look at the presenter and think to themselves, you have no clue who you're talking to right now. One of my friends, who's a Harvard graduate, Krista Sersing, his wife Nancy Sersing, some of you may know them. She became a professor of Russian literature in Moscow. And I was taken out for coffee by Krista and his wife Nancy. Her PhD, as I said, was in Russian art. She used to go to a corner art store and talk to this elderly Russian who had a magnificent collection. And she just said, I'll have coffee with him every day. Finally, one day, he realized how much she knew about Russian art as she would explain some things to him. She saw him go up to the bottom of a stairway. She knew enough Russian. And he called his wife from upstairs and said, I want you to come down and meet this American with a Russian soul. I want you to come down and meet this American with a Russian soul. She had identified with her listener. And unless we do that, all proclamation is going to fall on deaf ears. Translation, our message in their idiom. It is a fact that language is changing. Idiomatically, we are communicating to each other differently. Who was it? Andrew Fletcher, the Scottish political activist, who said, let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. This generation bears its soul in its music and tells you its story in lyrics, and they don't lie in their lyrics. They will tell you exactly what they're looking for. And so it was Moody Blues. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? And an amazing end to that song, I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I'm looking for someone to change my life. Translation, how we do it, whether it's done in an artistic form, the best form of communication today oftentimes is in watching a movie and discussing it. We were talking about it at lunch. Identification, translation, thirdly, persuasion. What in your communication to the listener is going to be persuasive? Let me give you an example of a movie in this, how well it is done. This was in a movie called The Emperor's Club. I think Kevin Kline played the lead role, and it's a story of young Shakespearean experts, students going to a school on Shakespeare and knowledge of all of that. And one guy, through influence from his father as a senator, gains entrance into the school. He didn't have the academics, but he had the influence, so he got in. And every step of the way he's cheating. He's cheating, he's cheating, he's making his way till he's down to the final 4 in a quiz. And the other 3 are all standing in their togas, as with him, And the teacher's Kevin Klein, he's throwing one question after another. They're all answering. It comes down to one final question, and this guy cheats his way into the answer and wins it. And the teacher knows he's cheated, but he doesn't know how to pin it on him. Years go by, and this guy who cheated becomes a big businessman owning a country club and so on. And he phones the teacher and he says, I know what you think about me. Find the other 3 guys wherever they are. I'll host it in my country club. We'll do it all over again. I'll invite a who's who list from the community. So the teacher contacts the other 3. They are just some middle-level workers somewhere. This guy's the big tycoon. He hosts it. The test begins. The teacher's throwing question after question again. Once again, this fellow cheats. And he wins. And the teacher walks away from that, doesn't know what to do. He goes back to his room, picks up his briefcase, goes into the men's room in the country club just before he's about to get into his limo to go back to the airport. And when he's in the men's room, this tycoon comes in and he says, what's your problem? What's the big deal? So, I cheated. But look at where I am today. Look at the other 3. I've made it, man. And he's giving the teacher this tremendous speech punctuated with what difference does it make? I've made it. What difference does it make? Teacher is finally washing his hands and about to walk out of the bathroom there. Suddenly they hear a toilet flush. They didn't know there was somebody else in there. And the cubicle door opens and it's this tycoon's little son. He walks out of the cubicle, looks at his dad, and his lips start quivering, and the eyes fill with tears, and he walks out of there. And the teacher looks at him and says, what's the difference? What difference does it make? See, he captured the power of passing on that which is right to the next generation in a 2-minute dialogue. What I want to say to you is that this whole idea of persuasion, we have to come to it, how it is done. In the East, it is still the story. It is still the story. In fact, your latest Dartmouth publication has a Pakistani professor here on the front cover as the great storyteller. Just picked it up today. The story still has power in the East. And finally, justification. Why this truth and not any other? Identification, translation, persuasion, justification. The second set of 4 is this. You must awaken a sense of need. How do you get to understanding a point of entry in need? This is where I think God works his work in individual hearts, where something happens in a person's life where a need is awakened. Number 2, if Jesus is the answer, he will have an answer to that need. You must awaken sense of need. Number 2, if Jesus is the answer, he will have an answer to that need. Number 3, Jesus is not only an answer, but must be seen to be true. That's the link that's the hardest. That's the link that is the hardest. Jesus is not only an answer, but must be seen to be true. And the 4th point there is that the listener ultimately cannot remain neutral. Awaken the sense of need. If Jesus is the answer, he will meet that need. Jesus is not only an answer, but must be seen to be true. You cannot remain neutral. These 4, from identification, translation, persuasion, justification, and your methodology to the recipient of awakening the sense of need. If Jesus is an answer, he'll have an answer to that need. Jesus is not only an answer, but must be seen to be true, and you cannot remain neutral. That is really the task of communicating in the public square. And the most important thing then comes out to this. You must start off with a point of reference, how you determine a discussion. You must make sure you get to the point of relevance. What is it in the gospel that brings relevance? And finally, you will not be able to avoid the point of disturbance. Some of those truths will bring disturbance to the listener. Let me give you an example of this. When you talk to a listener, I remember a person whom I was dialoguing with for a long period of time, and his biggest struggle was one of meaning. And I see this again and again and again. Meaning, meaning, meaning. The other illustration I was going to give to you would take long. Let me cut to the chase and just close with a very quick one here. The two guys sitting in front here, Nabeel, my colleague, and Matt travels with me. No, very good friend we have just met over the last 5-6 months. His name is Hayden Coe. He's a well-known actor in the Philippines. Tall, strapping, good-looking guy. I was in Manila in June, asked to speak on the subject of purpose and meaning. Actually, I wasn't asked to speak at all. I was told I was going out for dinner till I found out I was speaking. And there they were, sitting around a table. In this work, there's no free lunch. I didn't even have my notes. And I spoke about meaning because they asked me to. They just gave me a lectern. And at the end of it, this guy goes up to the microphone, tears running down his face, and he says, "You're talking about meaning?" He said, "I'm standing before you here today with guilt and shame and pain. I have no meaning." I looked at him and commented on what a good-looking guy he was, and I said, "You're the one who's telling us you don't have any meaning?" Oh, find out later, he's a very famous film actor in the country. In fact, as we drove out of there, we saw his picture on billboards. He'd messed up, really messed up big time. He's got numerous fragrances named after him. He was the most popular actor in the country, kind of an icon. You can't go anywhere where you see a Filipino who doesn't recognize him. But he's messed up, completely messed up in his private life. If he were here, he would tell you what happened. He was carrying on in a private life. A lot of that was videoed and went viral and shattered him. And all of a sudden, from being an icon to cowering in public as a total failure. And he says, "Everything I got, I deserved. Everything I got, I deserved." He follows us around the globe now. He pays his own way. He was with us in India. He was with us in Singapore, with us in Indonesia, coming to the US in a few days to join us. And you know, we took him to a meeting for children where our ministry was building a school for 200 kids last week in Chennai. The boys, Matt will tell you, he sat through that whole event, tears running down his face, watching these tiny little kids in prayer and singing hymns and talking about what it meant to know Christ. This tiny little tyke who stands like this and prays for me and gives a speech. And as soon as she finished, the principal leans over to me and says, "Her father is in prison for murder." Hayden holds up his camera, which he paid for thousands of dollars, and he says to Matt, "I've been living for my ego and myself all these years, and I look at these kids in their need and how blind I have been to what the world has really needed. I've been living only for myself." You see, the paradigm shift is dramatic. The whole way of viewing reality when Christ enters your life and changes you. I just say to you, meaning and purpose are at a high premium today. The world and the university student knows it very well, the longing for meaning. And in the persuasion, if you can convince an individual of what is the meaning Jesus Christ brings to you in the public square, you will always have a listening audience because humanity is searching for it. God bless you from the identification, translation, persuasion, justification, from the need to truth. And you move from reference to relevance to disturbance. These are some snippets of trying to engage people in the public area. God bless you, and on to Nabeel.
Well, it's really hard to follow up Ravi Zacharias, especially if you're not Michael Ramsden, which I am not. So I would like to open in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that we can gather here, God, to learn more about you, to speak more about you, and also to encourage one another that you are the way, the truth, and the life, and it is through you and the proclamation of you that we can heal the ails and maladies of this world. God, I pray that you would be here today through all the people who are here in the audience, the people who are watching online. Lord, I pray that you would touch hearts, that you'd prepare hearts to hear a message that you would like to share. And God, I pray that you would speak through me to accomplish your purposes and your will, because this world is hurting too much to not have you in its midst. And so, Lord, please reach your people today. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think it's in the university setting is one of the very few places where you can have an Indian speak and then have a Pakistani follow up and there be no problems. It's one advantage of being in the university. I find myself at home in the university partially for that reason. You can talk about just about anything once you understand that it's in the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom and mutual advancement. Part of what I grew up with growing up, and I know Uncle is probably the same way in an Indian culture, growing up is Pakistani culture, Indian culture, Middle Eastern culture, really doesn't matter. You talk about what's important to you. You put it right out there, and you don't hide this stuff. Growing up, I remember the first time I found out that you don't talk about politics and religion was when I approached my 7th grade teacher and I said, "Who are you going to vote for this year?" And she looked at me as if I had just asked her how old she was, which is what I did with my 2nd grade teacher. And she said, "You don't ask these questions about politics." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "You just don't talk about politics and religion." Well, growing up, that's all we talked about in our culture was politics and religion. It's what was on our heart and what was on our mind. And so from a very young age, that's what I was ready for. That's what I did. In fact, that's what I was trained to do. Growing up as a Muslim in the United States, part of what identified me and my person was that I had to not only embrace Islam and embrace it willingly, I had to be able to represent it in the public square. My mom told me from a very young age, she gave me a pep talk, and she said, "Nabeel, you are Muslim. You look Muslim. And the first thing anyone understands about you when they see you is that you represent Islam. It doesn't matter if you're the valedictorian of your school. It doesn't matter if you're the president of the United States. It doesn't matter who you are. The first thing people are going to ascribe to you is Islam. You're an ambassador for Islam. So you need to be able to speak about what you believe. And you need to be able to represent it well." So that's how I grew up, understanding that dialogue is a part of living in a society where you represent yourself with pride. And so from a very early age, I used to challenge Christians regularly in their belief in order to defend my beliefs as well. And so whenever I found someone who was reading the Bible or someone who was proclaiming Christ, I would challenge them immediately. Why? Why do you believe Jesus is God? What do you believe about the Trinity? These are questions that I would ask from the age of middle school and high school. And something that I learned very quickly was that since people had not engaged in this kind of dialogue, they weren't generally ready to answer those kinds of questions. As a Muslim growing up, I was taught that Christians have no idea what the Trinity is or why they believe it, but they'll tell you what's important. And so I used to test that. Whenever I saw a Christian, I'd ask them, "Do you believe in the Trinity?" And they'd say, "Absolutely." And I'd say, "Is this an important belief?" And generally they'd respond by saying, "If I didn't believe it, I'd be a heretic." I say, "Okay, what is it?" No answer. "Well, God's 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Well, what does that mean? "Well, it's kind of like water. You see, water can go from ice to vapor to liquid." I'm like, "God's water? I'm not catching this." "Well, okay, he's kind of like an egg." Okay, we're getting worse here. What is the Trinity? And no one was able to articulate it because they simply hadn't engaged in the practice before. And so their own thoughts about their beliefs hadn't been as refined. And I noticed this as a Muslim very early on. Part of the reason why I'm really excited to be here tonight is because it was at the university level where I was finally able to engage in dialogue with people who disagreed with me, but intelligently. It was when I got to the university that I challenged a Christian on his reading of the Bible. He and I were in the public speaking and debate team, the forensics team together, and I saw him open up a Bible. And I thought, "Ooh, this guy's a Christian. All right, this will be fun. Time to take down another one." So why do you believe that book is the Word of God? Why? Don't you know it's been changed over time? Don't you know Jesus spoke Aramaic, and the earliest church was in Jerusalem? They probably spoke Hebrew, and then the New Testament is actually written in Greek, so don't you realize that Jesus' words went through a translation of a translation before they were ever written in the Gospels? And then the Greek New Testament isn't the Bible that lasted the span of time. It was the Latin Vulgate, which lasted the longest period of time before it came into German through the Latin. And so you've got a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, which explains why you have the ESV, the NIV, the RSV, the NASB, the who knows what V. You've got so many versions of the Bible. How do I know which one is the Word of God? That was the attack that I launched at him, one that I had launched on many people before. But here was the difference. for the first time, I ran into someone who was willing to engage in dialogue, had engaged in these dialogues before, in fact, with other Muslims, and so he was prepared to give me answers to these questions. And immediately we became best friends. That was something I realized, that he had a zeal for God, and I had a zeal for God, and that's something I connected with him, and nobody else really connected with me like that. And so we became best friends. Now, granted, we argued all the time. He was studying biology, I was doing pre-med at the time, so we had some overlap in our course requirements. So we would be looking at our schedules and thinking, okay, what course are you going to sign up for genetics? I'll sign up for genetics too. Why? So we can argue about the deity of Christ. Why else? And so we would sign up for classes to argue with each other, and we would regularly. But here's the thing. I knew that my friend, his name is David, I knew my friend David would take a bullet for me. Okay, I knew this because we spent time together all the time. He invited me to his house. He had me try his dad's jerky. I invited him to my house. My mom bombarded him with food, and so he came back to my house very regularly. So we spent all this time together. We became real friends. And in the course of that, I knew that when he challenged me as a person and when he challenged my beliefs, it wasn't because he was trying to tear me down. This is my best friend. I knew he would sacrifice himself for me, and therefore I could listen to what he had to say. And it was in the context of these kinds of, we went to movies together. I remember when Passion of the Christ came out. I was a Muslim at the time. He invited me to come see Passion of the Christ, and we discussed it afterwards. When debates would come to town, I lived in Virginia Beach at the time. Regent University was there, and there was a debate between a Muslim sheikh, Shabir Ali, and a Christian scholar, Mike Licona. We went to watch that debate on the resurrection of Jesus, and at the end of that debate, we talked for hours. We spent 2 hours in his car just talking about the debate, and we dialogued about these things. So being able to communicate with one another on this was central to what I ultimately believe was the most important decision of my life. Had I not had someone who was willing to engage in this dialogue with me, I don't think I'd be here today. And just recently, I was with Uncle in Indonesia and Singapore, and I was talking with some of the students who are there. And many of them are very, very afraid about what they say in the public realm because, especially in Indonesia, the majority population is Muslim. And even though it's technically legal for you to talk about these things, public opinion gets turned against you very fast if you challenge Islam. And I just couldn't help but think, if I grew up in Indonesia, I probably wouldn't have accepted Christ because people would not have engaged in dialogue with me as willingly or as readily. We need to make sure we understand and embrace the power of dialogue. And true dialogue only happens when we're willing to understand each other's differences and discuss them. There's this constant idea now in society for some reason that tolerance is only such that you bear one another's disagreements. You don't actually talk about them. You just say, I love you, I accept you as a person, and I'm not going to talk about our disagreements. No, true tolerance is when you can love a person in spite of the disagreements. That is real tolerance. And that's what happens when you engage in this kind of dialogue. So the dialogues that we had, that David and I had, were very, very important to me because what mattered when I was growing up was my parents had taught me that Islam was the truth. Now, to give you an understanding of how much they taught me that, my mother is the daughter of a Muslim missionary. Okay, my mother was actually born in Indonesia. Even though she's Pakistani, she was born in Indonesia because her father spent his life preaching Islam in Indonesia. And so she was a missionary kid, a Muslim missionary kid. My grandmother, so my mom's mother, same thing, born in Uganda because her father was a Muslim physician who was preaching and healing in Uganda. And so I was raised with very, very devout Muslim parents. And part of what they taught me early on is, Nabeel, you should only believe the truth, which is why they'd have me challenge other people in their faith. Because if there's a truth, there aren't multiple truths, or at least not multiple contradictory truths. There can only be one set. And for me, the truth was extremely important. And so that is why I would discuss these things in dialogue with people on these matters. And so when it came to the issue of Christianity, as I was dialoguing with David, it took about a year for me to conclude that the New Testament is in fact trustworthy, that there are no significant changes of any sort in the New Testament. Yeah, you might have orthographical spelling things, but there's no change in the New Testament of any kind of doctrine, any meaningful thing whatsoever. And when I realized that, I said, okay, how do we know what the truth is? How do I know if Islam is true or Christianity or something else entirely? And I became much more interested in methodology at that point, and I wanted to isolate what are the core truth claims of each of these faiths. What is the core truth claim of Christianity? Well, I found it in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. It says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That Jesus is Lord, his deity, that he died on the cross for the sins of mankind, and that he rose from the dead on the third day as the firstborn. Death, deity, and resurrection, these three things are what makes Christianity true. And let me distill this for you. I went through medical school. I focused a lot in my fourth year in medical school in psychiatry. I was very interested in healing the mind as well as the body. And part of what I found regularly in the psychiatry ward was people came in with delusions of grandeur, often claiming to be God himself. Now, if we had someone come in claim to be God, our trained response was, well, that's great. There's a room for you here. It's padded and locked. You'll love it. And so it's normal. Now, if a man in the first century named Jesus claimed to be God, we would be perfectly justified in saying, you're crazy, unless he proved that claim. And how would such a man go about proving a claim? Let's say he said, I will be killed, and on the third day, I will raise myself from the dead. Now you're talking. If this man actually dies and then raises himself from the dead 3 days later, that proves his claim to being God. Or at the very least, it gives him some far more supernatural weight than we'd otherwise expect from someone. And if there's anyone I'm going to listen to about the afterlife, it's the person who's been there and came back. And so these three historical matters. Did Jesus claim to be God? That became a core search of mine. Did he die on the cross? Did he rise from the dead? If these three things can be shown with a strong historical case, then we have a strong case for Christianity. Now understand, Islam teaches all kinds of things about Jesus. Islam teaches that Jesus is the most miraculous man who ever lived. Islam teaches that Jesus was virgin born, that he's able to heal the blind, that he's able to raise the dead. This is all found in Surah Al-Imran of the Quran. It's said that Jesus is the Messiah who's going to come back and initiate the end of times. But there's three things in Islam that you should not believe about Jesus. Number one, you can't believe he died on the cross. Number two, you can't believe he raised from the dead. And number three, you can't believe that he is God. The very three things that Christianity says you must believe in order to be saved, those are the three things Islam denies about Jesus most boldly. And so all of the truth studies I was doing came to head on this, and I invested myself on learning the historical method and on studying history in these matters. And after a total of 4 years of studying and praying, I realized that the case for Christianity was extremely strong. The case for Islam was on far weaker grounds, and that's not the topic of tonight's discussion. But it brought me to a point of absolute despair, because I was the only son in my family. I was the flag bearer for Islam in my community. I was the one who, when my father wasn't around, I would lead the Friday prayers. My cousins came to me and asked me to do tafsir, to do commentary on the hadith, on the traditions of Islam. That was me. And here I was thinking about becoming a Christian. Everything hinged on this matter. Now, I'll pause there for just a moment and I'll move forward. When you discuss religious matters with your friends, when you discuss religious matters with people in the public square, there's two important areas that I think we should keep our minds on. The first is what I've just discussed up until now, and that is truth. Truth matters. Truth really does matter. And we need to be able to explore issues of truth, but we should never divorce the impact of our message from the beauty of the message. Fact of the matter is, you can pummel someone with truth and they'll walk away more disdainful of your message than before. There is something absolutely wondrously beautiful about the truth. And if we can't marry the two together in our message will fall apart. Now, just the other day, yesterday in fact, I was watching this new movie, Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, Gravity. Saw it at the Nugget here. Is that what it's called, the Nugget? It's quite a theater. So I'm watching this movie, and I realized that this is not a Christian movie by any means, at least it didn't appear so. Yet you're asking some very important questions that generally are not answered by the public realm of thought, such as, why am I here? What's life about? Why do so many people die meaninglessly? Why has no one ever taught me to pray when in this moment of need, I need to be able to pray? These are the questions that are being asked. And the beauty of the Christian message also shown through that movie, because there's a moment of self-sacrifice, unlike many others in that movie. And you think, wow, there is this underlying thread of recognition in our minds that self-sacrifice is one of the highest virtues that man has. You see the same thing in Batman, you see the same thing in Superman, you see in all these movies of heroes, this notion of self-sacrifice. Where does that come from? Now, if you can explain to someone that the Christian message, while watching these movies or right after watching these movies, that the Christian message is the ultimate embodiment of self-sacrifice, that all of a sudden clicks with people. Jesus is not some God who tells you, jump through these hoops in order to make me happy when you're dead. That is not the gospel message. The gospel message is that God, who loved us from before the creation of this world, saw that we would destroy ourselves. And so he allowed himself to be destroyed at our hands for our sake, self-sacrifice, so that we could be with him, so that we could live in eternal bliss forever, glorifying God. He would rescue us though we spat in his face. He gave us hands to work with, and we used them to sin against him. He gave us feet to walk on, and we used them to walk away from him. And instead of taking those things back, he gave us his Son. What kind of beauty is ready to be found there? Unbelievable. You know, growing up as a Muslim, no one ever told me these things. Okay, I was taught to follow the Sharia. I was taught that if I do good things, God will love me. The Quran says very clearly, God does not love the unrighteous. If I do bad things, God will not love me. Now, if someone said to me, Nabeel, understand, God is your Father. Now, you tell me for a moment, Nabeel, if you sinned against your Father here on earth, your human Father, would he not love you anyway? Absolutely he would. It wouldn't matter if I became a serial killer, my Father would love me. He would disapprove of what I did. He would hope I changed, but he would love me. Now, if someone would have just taken that one step further and said, do you think your Father loves more than God? God is a loving Father. He loves unconditionally. This message is so beautiful, it resonates with our very core. And even here in Dartmouth, I have a friend who graduated from here in 2005. She said, Nabeel, make sure you don't miss the murals in the basement of Baker Library. And I go down there, the Orozco murals, and I see this very vibrant imagery of multiple cultures clashing, ultimately this concept of education and of meaninglessness in the face of potential meaning. And you see this and you think, the gospel fits this. The truth answers yet even this. To rein in the beauty that's so naturally expressed in stories and in art, while also making sure we emphasize the truth. That is how we can share our message meaningfully in the public forum. That is how I became convinced of the truth of the gospel. It took 4 years. And it also took a powerful spiritual act from God, a vision and 3 dreams, which led me to Christ. But it was only because of all these things that I'm able to say that my life today is more meaningful than it ever would have been otherwise. So I encourage you, as you think about sharing your faith in the public forum, think about both those things, truth and beauty, and present both in the gospel to your friends and to those who so desperately need it. Thank you so much.
One, two. All right. Thank you very much. Now we're going to get ready for the Q&A, and if I can have my 2 volunteers. Can you be in this aisle? All right, the microphones are going to be passed around by Jake and Andrew. So if you have a question.
Gentleman in the middle.
Should I stand up? This desk is kind of in my way. I have a lot of stuff. So, Ravi, I've seen you in Wheaton, Camp of the Woods, Washington, D.C., and here. So my question is, when are you going to hire me? Kidding. My question is, well, kind of kidding. Maybe in the future. For both of you guys, when it seems like the clear answer is, you really, for someone to listen to you, you need to get to know them, befriend them, love them. You mentioned that one of your best friends, like you'd listen to him because you knew he'd die for you, right? And then what Dr. Zacharias said about the American woman with the Russian soul. What's the point, though? At what point can you finally, like the breaking point, because you have these friends and you don't want to push them away, and you really care about them, but sometimes they're not receptive, but like how long? I mean, you can have friends for years and they don't, like, once in a while things might happen, but at what point do you, where you write them a letter of proclamation or something? Like, I'm just sitting there, I'm like, ask me questions, I have answers. I've read all Dr. Zacharias' books, but like these are people that you literally die for, and they're hurting, and they're looking everywhere but where you're at, and you just wait it out? You just keep waiting and like drop hints once in a while, but it was like you had just said, sir, everything but religion and politics, and you just gotta keep it to yourself. So I'm just wondering, how do you engage someone who really doesn't care, who you really love, without pushing them away?
A good question, and we might both take a stab at these, and I appreciate it. And what we'll do for the ground rules is we take one question per person, and we'll get as many in as possible. Your point is well taken, and I'll tell you what, coming from the East, where you can go around in circles on the same thing again and again and again and again. I have a friend in Atlanta who graduated from the Bombay Institute of Technology and Engineer, and he started asking me questions. So every Sunday when I was in town, he would come over and we'd have some coffee, and his wife. And after several months of this, my wife said to me, in listening to you two guys, she says, I think you answered this 4 weeks ago. You guys, he's just going around in circles. I said, welcome to the Indian mind. We do go around in circles. Every good turn deserves another, so we keep turning. Sometimes these things are cultural. At other times, they are realities that go back to a previous struggle. He or she can't make a step forward. The truth of the matter is, the answer is, it applies in a different way to different people in different circumstances. If I'm sitting next to a person on a plane, I may have 1 hour on a flight, and the conversation begins and ends there. If you're a neighbor, you can go on for weeks on end, a year or two. If you're a family member, it may come up at every meal, or they may want to silence you. I think the most important thing to know is that you never, ever for the want of a better word, just ram it down a person's throat. You never do that. Because in doing that, you're going to choke them. And what you're trying to bring them is not life, not stuffing them with something. If you will be a careful listener, you will know at what point to back off. And at what point they will enter into the discussion again. I can just tell you from experience what I've noticed. Sometimes what you have said may take harvest 5 or 6 years later, when something intersects with their life that they are going to have a hard time getting out of, but your words keep coming back to them. And so when the seed is sown, somebody else will water it, and God alone will bring the increase. Don't try to force a harvest at any time. Be a witness and know when to, it's important to know when to speak and when not to speak. And don't ever feel defeat because the moment has not yielded the fruit. Testimonies come and go, and I had a guy who was truly angry with me, even though I'd hardly said anything, because he was an Indian, I was an Indian, we were in New Brunswick. Somebody invited him because he was an Indian and I was an Indian, and I thought, it's like telling you I have an Indian friend by the name of Singh, would you happen to know him? This sort of thing. And so they bring him, and he just held it against me, and he considered me as a traitor to my culture. He was a teacher. We had a miserable dinner at a friend's home, and I just left it at that. Several years went by. My wife and I were living in Toronto, and I got a telephone call from Princess Margaret Hospital, which I knew was a cancer hospital. And he said, my name is so-and-so, and I was trying to remember the name. He said, I was with you in New Brunswick some years ago. I said, I remember you well. He said, can you come and visit me in the hospital? And I said, sure. Is everything okay? He said, no, I'd really like to see you. So I bent over, and here I didn't recognize him. First of all, time had gone by. Secondly, he was pretty fragile looking. And he said, I asked to see you, Ravi, because I was really hostile towards you when you hardly said anything except that I knew you'd come into my town to preach. But you did tell me you were a follower of Jesus and so on. He said, I hated anybody who tried to say anything to me that was contrary to my belief. Long story, was stricken with cancer. He said, I never forgot your kindness and your demeanor towards me on that day. And he turned his life over to Jesus Christ. I never had anything to do with it after that dinner. It's just the work of God. Just yesterday, Jerry Jenkins, the author, sent me a little link to how a person through kindness, and he talked about watching Francis Schaeffer once deal with a little deformed child, and he just stroked the child's face and just prayed with the child and walked away all tear-stained in his face. He said it was the kindness of kindness that needed to be shown. He takes 3 illustrations and shows how that kindness was never forgotten by the individual. Timing is God's. Opportunity may be yours. Let God put in the time. You don't determine when that ends, and don't fret over it. I think when you've done what needs to be done, you will be amazed what God does as a result. I think when we stand before Him, we'll be shocked as to how He used some of us when we had no clue whatsoever of what we were doing. Leave that with you. Thanks. Another question is right in the front here. Here. Nabeel, you can take this one.
Dr. Qureshi, you listened very carefully to what you were saying, and clearly the beauty of the relational, both the beauty of your friendship with David, your Christian friend, was a very compelling factor that led you towards Jesus. And also what you described as the beauty of the relational life and activity of Jesus was very compelling, informative as well. And in the allusion you made to the vision and the 3 dreams that were pivotal in perhaps sealing your interest in Jesus, in the way that He used those in your life, did you see, even at the time, this coalescence of beauty and relationship in the content and in the details of what you experienced?
I really wasn't struck at the time. It was something that came later. I was in the middle of it. I was really struggling to figure out what was true. And in the middle of that, my mind was a lot more focused on the cost I was about to have to pay. Because if I wanted to become a Christian, if I wanted to follow Jesus, I was going to have to give up everything. I was going to have to give up my relationship with my family. My family is, a unit of 4. My father was in the U.S. Navy for 24 years, and so he moved around a lot. And they were all I had, and I had to be willing to say no to that. I had to be willing to potentially give up my life. Even in the United States, not nearly as problematic as it is in other parts of the world. But even here in the United States, this was around 2004 that I'm thinking about these things. 2005 is when I became a Christian. In 2004, there was a whole family of Coptic believers in New Jersey that was stabbed to death because of their proclamation of Jesus by Muslims who came and killed them. New Jersey. And so I'm having to wrestle with these things. I didn't quite understand the coalescence of the beauty of the message and the truth until later. Later when I realized, because all that time my mind was really focused on me. It was me, 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 me. And later when I realized what the gospel message was, I'll tell you what happened since you brought it up. There you go, bringing things up. My family, when they found out that I became Christian, I didn't know how to tell them. If you ask any former Muslim who becomes a Christian, it's extremely difficult to tell. I didn't know how to tell them. My friend David said, Nabeel, you have to tell your parents. I said, no, I don't. It's not in the Bible. And he says, Nabeel, you're going to be baptized. Baptism is a proclamation, a public proclamation of your faith. You have to tell them. I said, no. and he said, Nabeel, I'm the one baptizing you. I'm not going to baptize you until you tell your parents. And I said, yes, you are, and I'm not telling them. And he said, fine, I'm praying that they'll find out. A few days later, they found out. And it was definitely God's hand making them find out. And when they found out, my father, like I said, 24 years in the U.S. Navy, he was to me like my Superman. I mean, he just epitomized strength to me. And he said to me, Nabeel, this day I feel as if my backbone has been ripped out from inside me. And he has not stood as tall since that day. And my mother, who was always full of life and joy and happiness, the life of the party, she lost the gleam in her eye that day. She's never been happy with me since. I've never heard the words, I'm proud of you, since then. And as I was wrestling with what I had to give up the next day, on my knees, in tears, saying, God, I believed a week ago. Why didn't you kill me when I believed? Why didn't you kill me? Because if you killed me, we'd all be happy. I'd be with you. My parents wouldn't have known. We'd all be happy if you'd killed me. And it was in that moment when I realized this was not at all about me. Like up until now, I've just been thinking, me, 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 me. What's the truth? I need to follow the truth. I need to know who God is. And those are good things, don't get me wrong. But once you find out what the gospel message is, it is the least selfish message of all of history. The idea is that you pour yourself out for the sake of your enemies. You have to become like Jesus. Well, what did Jesus do? He's on a throne being worshipped by angels. He made himself nothing to be killed by those who were sinning against him. And then he looks at us and says, go and do likewise. If you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to be a Christ follower, that means you have to be ready to die for the sake of your enemies. There's nothing selfish about that. And it was when I figured that out and I realized that truly selflessness is one of the most beautiful things, and that it goes hand in hand with the truth, this Christian message. That's when I realized that truth and beauty coalesced into one message, the gospel. It was at that moment, not until then, when I was thinking very selfishly.
Not in the dreams.
Not in the dreams. Not in the dreams. I can't go into detail on the dreams. It would be here a while. But I have a book coming out. Buy it. It's in there. So it wasn't in the dreams that I realized this. It was later. And sometimes we try to force people to understand everything about Christianity up front. There's massive tectonic shifts happening in people's minds where they're moving these pieces around. They're not going to get it all at once. And this goes to your question as well. It took 4 years for me to come to this point where I gave my life to Christ. And in the middle of that, people were telling my friend David, you've been asking us to pray for Nabeel for years now. The Bible says, stop throwing your pearls before the swine. Give it up. He's not going to believe. It took a long time for these plates to shift and for me to fall on my knees to ask God who he was. And then it took his timing to reveal himself to me. And ultimately is when I read the Bible, when I really realized that this was the truth. And all that took time to happen. The dreams happened before I put those pieces together.
Those poor friends obviously didn't understand Islamic theology very well to have quoted that verse about you. not to cast your pearls before swine. I want to add one footnote to that. It is, as you go through life, I've unfolded this in a book I've written called The Grand Weaver. What you have raised is so critical. As you're processing in your walk towards Christ or even in Christ, a lot of it comes through to you as something you have done, you have chosen, you have moved towards. The older you get, the more you see it was His handiwork, His design, His pulling together of the threads. When you're young, the focus is not in that grand picture. When you're older and look back, I'm 67 now. I came to know Christ on a bed of suicide when I was 17. I find it absolutely incredible what God has done in half a century. Never envisioned, and so will be in your life and everyone else's. The illustration I give is this because the point of beauty He's made is so critical, and Alistair McGrath stresses this a lot too. People like Colin Gunt and Jeremy Begbie, many British authors are focusing a lot on this. In fact, Jill Caratini on our staff, who does the Just Thinking, she's doing her work at Duke now on this whole theme of beauty. And the picture I give is if you watch an Indian sari being made, I need to get behind here, I think this sound feedback. It's generally done by a team of two, a father and son. The saris that are being woven for weddings are spectacular. Red, gold, silver, brilliant colors. Just two people, father and son. The father sits on a platform, the son sits below. The father's got all the spools of thread next to him. The son does just one thing. When the father nods, he moves the shuttle from right to left and left to right. Father pulls some threads together, nods, and I looked at my wife and I said, I can do what the son does. I can move the shuttle from right to left and left to right. I said, I can't do what the father does. I can't pull the right threads together. And at the end, when you've seen a sari woven, you know that the design has always been in the father's mind. The son just responds to the nod. He had very little to do with the design itself. I think that's the beauty of God's handiwork in every life. He does not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He will even conquer through it.
Amen.
And that's the grand design of what He accomplishes. We'll take a couple more.
All right, we have a question from the poll. Could you speak to how to have productive conversations about secular issues like abortion, sex, and politics with secular peers while acknowledging faith but not making them feel like you're just evangelizing them?
Did you say that was for Nabeel? Is that or what?
Either
no,
of
anyone.
you.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. So repeat it again. Could
Yeah,
you tell
sure.
how you can have meaningful conversations?
Yeah, could you speak to how to have productive conversations about secular issues like abortion, sex, and politics with secular peers while acknowledging faith but not making them feel like you're just evangelizing them?
I think, well, I'll go first. You and since you took the
By
long
all
answer
means.
last time. Yeah. I think it's a very, well, all of the questions are great. It's a very sensitive issue in our time, you know. All of these are very critical because all of a sudden one can win a battle on a particular issue and lose the war on the major issues. Here's the way I try to do it, and that is very simply stated, and you don't always succeed. You know, I always tell my colleagues, you're not answering a question, you're answering a questioner. If you answer a question disregarding the questioner, you may win a momentary argument, but you've not won the person. So it is very important to give them a chance to speak, much more than giving yourself a chance to speak. When you dialogically engage, as Paul did many times, the word is dialegomenos. It's used many times in Acts, and the word is persuasively used as well. So here's what I try to approach, not on the particulars, I try to approach on the foundation, because everything else is symptomatic. The definition is primary. I'll give them something like this. You know, in the beginning of the biblical narrative, there's only one prohibition given to man, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is incredible. With all that God could have stipulated, He just made one prohibition, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why? Because on the day that you do, you will be as God, knowing good and evil. What it really means is you will end up playing God, defining good and evil. And that's the one prohibition. Don't play God. And so what happens, that's the one thing they violated. They wanted to play God. And look at our world today, what has happened. All trees are protected except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Moral reasoning is completely up for grabs while we've got our feet firmly planted in midair on moral reasoning. So what happens? Every word dies the death of 1,000 qualifications because we have redefined everything. It is not good enough on the plane for them to tell us not to mess with the smoke detector. They have to tell us not to touch, tamper, disable, or destroy, because each one has a different meaning. Otherwise, in a court of law, you'll say, I didn't tamper with it, I just destroyed it. Or, this is the kind of thing where words become used and misused and abused. I heard one lawyer telling me he never asks a witness, were you ever alone in the room with so-and-so when it happened, because technically he can say no, because if you're with somebody, you're really not alone. But the point of the question is completely lost. So here's the thing. Who defines good and evil in any life? Sam Harris has made a valiant effort in his The Moral Landscape, which, pardon my saying so, but it's a sophomoric attempt at trying to explain moral reasoning. How a man of his intelligence actually expected that book to get anything but criticism roundly from philosophers and even from scientists, to say, is this what you've spent all your doctoral work doing, trying to tell us that goodness is nothing more than well-being, and tautologically going through to explain how well-being actually comes about? They can't. Trying to define moral reasoning apart from God, philosophers have tried it and they have absolutely failed. So here's the bottom line, starting point for me in any conversation. Is life sacred or purely material? If life is sacred, then the resultant definitions will have to be treated as sacred. If it is desacralized, then everything is desacralized, not just sexuality. Life itself is desacralized, and so rapacious acts, murder, and all of them are purely pragmatic expressions of one who is expressing their profanity. Richard Dawkins, in one of his talks, said, nothing is ultimately good or evil, we are all just dancing to our DNA. If he had a loved one in his family who was gang raped, like a couple of women in India, and it's hit the news there, and front and center in every discussion, in every open forum, would Dawkins really say it was a man and a gang dancing to their DNA? Or is something inherently evil being committed? So the issue is really not sexuality or abortion. The issue is life sacred, or is life matter and merely profane? On that, all the other discussions follow. If you desacralize life, then these are just perfunctory things. But if life is sacred, then so is the behavioral pattern. So to me, engaging them with, I move them away from the particulars, because that divides to the bottom line on which we can find some harmony. And if we don't find harmony there, then the secondary level naturally follows in two different directions. And again, we have to be very, very careful that we don't demonize the person of a counter perspective. Once you do that, you have lost the discussion. Stay with the idea and respect the person. And my mother used to say, once you've cut off a person's nose, there's no point giving them a rose to smell. And if you're presenting the beauty of Christ, there's no point cutting them down to the knees. Nabeel, do you wish to add to that anything?
I'll just say briefly, these issues come up regularly. I mean, when I was in med school, 4th year, we had an elective option, which was bioethics. And we had all kinds of questions where we were urged to discuss, what do we do in certain situations? We were given statistics on how much money was spent in our nation on the last few years of life. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I believe the number was 90% of healthcare costs go to the last year and a half of a person's life. And we're talking about looking at the entire national expenditure of healthcare. So the question was then posed in our class, why not pull the plug a year and a half earlier? Save 90% of the funds. use those same funds for other noble causes, helping people in need or establishing education for the younger generation? Why are we giving it to people who are about to die? Now, they toss that question out there with no basis for anyone to answer them. It's just simply go ahead and discuss. And there was no resolution to this. No one in the class, no teacher said this is the right answer or that's the right answer. It was just discuss. It was pretty clear to me at the time that no one had any basis for answering the question. Because should we try to preserve life at all costs? Why not cut it out a bit earlier? When does life even start to begin with? When does it not start? What is life? All these questions all of a sudden, which are very pertinent to real life, there's no basis to answer them. And so it's pretty easy, in fact, to bring up our discussion about faith and about worldview on matters of life. I'll give you another example. Just yesterday, I got a phone call from a dear friend last night at midnight who was in trouble. This is a friend who had called me in 2010 when he was thinking about committing suicide. And he asked me, why? Why is he suffering as much as he is, and whether or not there's any reason to continue. And the reason he called me, by the way, is because I had told him, if you ever think about committing suicide, will you at least promise to tell me first? And he did. And when he called me then, I was able to discuss with him just how wonderful he is. I mean, that friend of mine is so full of potential. He's so passionate and so caring. And it was his compassion and caring that makes him hurt as much as he does. But he's so full of potential and so full of life. And I could see him changing the world. And I told him this. And it's in that moment of friendship when really life really does matter. These questions come to the fore that you can engage them and tell them, look, not only do you matter to me as my friend, you matter to God. God created you. And you can explain to them at that moment, it's not preaching in that moment, it's not gratuitous information in that moment, it's the breath of life in that moment. And that's when people can receive it and it can affect them. And that's what led him to call me once again yesterday. And so really these matters come up, and when they come up, we need to be ready to share with them. It needs to be a part of us. We need to really imbibe this message, make it a part of who we are, such that at the right moment it naturally comes out. And that's how we engage the people around us.
I think time is gone, so let me just bring this to a close. Can I do that? We'll have another evening tomorrow, of course, at this. You know, I appreciate you all coming out on an evening like this with the kinds of questions you have and what we are trying to do, talking about sharing the beautiful message of Jesus Christ around the globe. And we do it with people of other worldviews, people of other faiths, people of hostile audience settings. I remember at one country of the world have 4 armed guards standing around while you're delivering your talk, and I said, boy, this is no fun. You know, you just don't want another question lest something else happen. But I'll tell you, the more you come to terms with how needy the world is, and somebody introduced me recently, I don't know where they get this from, but I was introduced in Mumbai as somebody whom world leaders are listening to. I thought, what? And I thought, nobody would want to take credit for that in these days, you know. Who on earth would consider that something to take credit for? Our world leaders are bereft of answers. They don't have it. And one of the presidents of Africa said to me, if I named him, you'd be shocked, but those conversations are private. I remember at that meeting, Gaddafi was there. All these big boys were there. Some of those demagogues have come and gone. It was one of those demagogues who put his arm in mine as we were walking away. And he said to me, Mr. Zacharias, our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. Our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. We simply don't have it politically. We are living in one of the most privileged nations of the world, and one look at what's happening in our political system and you say, when are we going to grow up? When are we going to learn to sit across the table and at least talk in a civil way and not seem like this is a boxing ring till one person is knocked out and the other left standing? People's lives are endangered by our behavior. It's what I told a sheikh in Jerusalem that I always come to. I say, until you and I are willing to receive the Son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for power and position and prestige. Abraham took his son up, and God said, don't. I myself. 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, God did offer his own son. And in the beauty of the gospel, I say this to you. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the only message in the world of any worldview, of any religious worldview, that comes because of God's grace and not because of your merit and mine. And number two, it is the only message in the world that offers redemption. Check it out. Check it out. The only message that offers grace and not on your merit. The only message that offers redemption. Those twin beauties are worth investigating. And when he says, I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly, the world needs the message. Find a way to connect with the people who are willing to listen, and don't give up hope. Sometimes the toughest cases turn out to be the most triumphant ones in the years to come. And we then say, it was all of God, very little of me. To the organizers, thank you very much. To those who are listening, God bless you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for joining us tonight. There were about 700 people joining us via live stream, so thank you for joining us as well. I invite you all to stay around, start some conversations, and also to enjoy some of our refreshments right outside. There's also some material in the back as well, and it's also for free. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.